Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Southeast New England Program Network and the New England Environmental Finance Center, welcome to our training on community climate resilience, bylaws, and best practices brought to you by Mass Audubon, EPA Region I, Cape Cod Commission, SRPEDD, and the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative. My name is Leah Soloway with the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be assisting with logistics for today's program, along with my colleague Tess Clark from Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin the webinar, there are a few logistics to keep in mind. First, everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. You'll be able to ask questions by typing them into the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We look forward to answering questions, so please type them in at any time. Additionally, you can request a certificate of attendance for joining this webinar. Information on how to do so will be available in our follow-up email after the webinar. Today, we also have closed captions available for the webinar. To view the closed captions, please click the link that Tess will put in the chat. Also, over in the control panel under handouts, we will have the presentation available for you to download. Now for a little bit about the SNEP network. Here you can see a map of the Southeast New England program region. The SNEP network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through management of stormwater and restoration projects. We focus on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNEP region. If you want to learn more, please visit our website, snepnetwork.org, for more information. And on that note, I'll hand things over to Heidi.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on community resilience. I know that climate change can be an overwhelming issue to tackle for many people because it is so global and so vast. However, there's so many things that could be done at the local level, and that's what we're going to focus on today. We have a large number of people signed up for this webinar. It's very exciting. We had well over 200 people signed up. Folks not only from municipal officials, from cities and towns all across Massachusetts, but also state officials, some federal government folks, regional planning agencies, planning consultants, and also I see that there are some folks here from other states, other regions, and we welcome you all. Most of the information that we're presenting here today is applicable across other states, not just Massachusetts. And I want to thank the SNEP Network for its support of this work and all of our partners and the great speakers that we have here today to share their expertise. I also want to thank the Lookout Foundation that has provided support to Mass Audubon for this work as well. Next. I'm just going to quickly review what we're going to go over during the webinar today. We have a packed agenda. There's a lot of information, but we do have our contact information at the end, as well as the handout is available, and there are additional resources available. I'm Heidi Ritchie, Director of Policy and Advocacy at Mass Audubon. I'm going to just do this introduction and a little bit of the follow-up at the end. Then Stephanie Covino is going to give an overview of the challenges and solutions before communities today. Danica Belknap from SRPEDD will be giving an overview of the role of local bylaws and regulations and Mass Audubon's Bylaw Review Tool. Mark Voorhees from EPA Region I is going to present some more technical information about the avoided costs that communities can accrue through using these methods. And then Tim Pascanaris, I was mispronounced that, please excuse me, and Tara Lewis from the Cape Cod Commission have a case study on a regional project they did with 4 communities around a shared resource. We will save some time near the end for Q&A, but you can type your questions into the chat throughout the program. And Tara is monitoring the questions. If there are any quick clarifying questions, she will answer them in the chat during the program, and more detailed questions for the speakers we will take near the end, and then provide some next steps and resources. This is an introductory webinar, and we will be doing more in-depth programs, hopefully in person later this year on the Bylaw Review Tool. Next. So we have several learning objectives for this webinar. We hope that by the end of the program, everyone attending will better understand the linkages between climate change impacts and land use. You'll be able to define key terms, nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, and low-impact development, and understand how they're interrelated. You'll understand the role of local regulations in reducing the costs and impacts, not only of climate change, but in other areas as well, such as water quality. And you will have access to the Bylaw Review Tool and other resources for utilizing it, and understand how it can be used to prioritize local updates of your municipal regulations. And then finally, we'll share some examples and additional resources. Next. Just real quickly, a little bit about Mass Audubon. Mass Audubon is an independent Audubon organization, not affiliated with National Audubon, although we do work with them on many issues of national significance. We were founded in 1896 by two very forward-thinking women who worked to stop the indiscriminate slaughter of birds. And ever since then, we've been doing advocacy, conservation, and education to protect the nature of Massachusetts. We have about 140,000 members. Next. Mass Audubon also just recently released our new exciting action agenda. And we can go to the next slide, and I just real quickly mention the three top line goals because they relate to the program we're presenting today. And these goals are interrelated, recognizing the role of land in both addressing climate through carbon sequestration, but also the many other functions and values that land provides for us, not just wildlife habitat, but also clean air and water, and many other important functions and values. We recognize the need for inclusive and equitable access to nature and all of its benefits for all people. And then we recognize also that climate change is the biggest issue that's affecting both people and nature, and that we all need to mobilize to act to address that. And of course, these things are interrelated because getting everyone involved and recognizing the role of nature and land in climate resilience and mitigation. Next. So from here, I'm going to hand it off to Stephanie.
Thank you, Heidi. So my name is Stephanie Cavino, and I'm the manager of the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative. So we're a pretty new organization that started in September of last year, and we work in the Blackstone Watershed, which is in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, focusing on climate resilience. So Heidi mentioned one of those challenges that we're facing already, which is climate change. And the other one, I'll give it to you right up front, is unsustainable development. But we're going to talk about today how we can still develop our communities and think about how we can make them climate resilient. So overall, we know that our climate is changing. It's not just a future problem, it's something that our municipalities are facing right now. So since 1985, we've already seen nearly a 3 degrees rise in temperature. And to put that into context, when there was a mile of ice over our heads here in Massachusetts, it was only 9 degrees cooler. So it's not really thinking like, oh, this morning, here in Worcester, it was, I think, 11 or something, and then later it's going to be 42 degrees. That's a big change, but it's not like if I have a fever, my temperature is 98 and to 101. That's only a few degrees, but it's a really big difference. We've also seen an increase in our strong storms. So instead of getting rain a little bit here and there, we're getting a lot more rain at once. So those strong storms are about 55% more than they used to be. And we're increasing our growing season. So our winters are shorter, our spring and fall are longer by 11 days right now, as measured since 1960. We also have nearly a foot of sea level rise as measured in Boston Harbor since 1922. And moving forward, these are going to continue increasing. So by 2100, we're looking at between 3 and 11 degrees Fahrenheit, almost a 5-week growing season, 3 to 7 feet of sea level rise, and about a 47% increase from where we already are on those strong storms. And to think about that, especially how it affects our infrastructure, if we have less snow and we have more rain and more of a freeze-thaw cycle, it's really affecting our infrastructure. I don't know about you guys, but here in Massachusetts, we have had a lot of potholes, and I know we're known for that, but we have even more than usual. And a lot of that is with that freeze-thaw cycle. It gets really warm, really cold, really warm, really cold, and it impacts our infrastructure. So if we go on to the next slide here, we're going to see that our climate change is hitting us hard, but those impacts are exacerbated by our land use patterns. So this is Massachusetts, and we have about a quarter of the land, 21% of it is developed, about a quarter of it is protected, 27%, and then there's over half, 52% of that land that is neither developed or protected. So that's our opportunity. What we do with that land is going to change how climate change is impacting us in the future. And this is from Mass Audubon's recent document of losing ground. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that our development is also sprawling. So around the 495 corridor, for those of you here in New England, you'll see that it has that crosshatched area, and this is where we are developing the fastest. So as we grow, we're not growing just within our own community, but we're taking up large lots, a lot of pavement, and that is impacting our communities. So the next slide, we're going to be putting together both climate change and development, thinking about how this impacts us. So when water falls in a forest, it gets soaked up into the ground, it goes into our groundwater supply, and we're okay. Our hydrology cycle is working how it should. But as we have more impervious surfaces and more of that water is going into those surfaces, it's running off and gathering nutrients. So we're going to click through this. So those impervious surfaces, we'll click again, gives us those nutrients coming down, and as climate change comes in, we have increased temperatures. As it's running off of those impervious surfaces, we have warmer water, so that's exacerbating this. And then also we have a lot of extreme precipitation that I mentioned, so we get a lot of flashy systems. When water runs off a lot of impervious surfaces, once we get to about 10% impervious within our community, we're affecting our water quality. And water quality, stormwater is the #1 source of water pollution in Massachusetts. We're also seeing a lot of increased drought, which seems counterintuitive, but it's that water's not coming a little bit at a time. Like I said, there's nothing and then it's all at once. And with that, we're having increased water drinking shortages. And that's becoming a problem for our municipalities. That's not only dangerous, but also can be quite expensive to purchase water somewhere else. So on our next slide, we get to solutions. We're going to put away all the bad stuff, no more gloom and doom. We're going to focus on what we can do because we know these solutions already. We're calling them nature-based solutions. These protect, restore, and manage an existing ecological system or mimic natural processes to protect public health and clean water, increase natural hazard resilience, and or sequester carbon. So we look at these in a few different ways. The first one is, if you click, conserving land. So I mentioned there's about 52% of Massachusetts left undeveloped and unprotected. That's our opportunity. The biggest thing we can do is conserve our natural systems that are already providing natural ecosystem services. They're making it cooler for us. They're conserving our water. They're keeping that water table where it should be so that we have drinking water. The next thing we can do is integrate these nature-based solutions and these ideas of protecting land that's most important and managing our water appropriately within new or redevelopment. And lastly, if you're in a city, there's still things you can do. You can restore resilience in urban areas through engineered solutions. So the next slide will show us that when we look at green infrastructure, when we look at nature-based solutions, we're looking at two kind of different things. You might have heard some of these terms. Green infrastructure, we call that more natural side. It refers to conservation or restoration of natural features and processes that are already providing those benefits. And then there's low impact development. That's the other side, which offers more of these engineered solutions to mimic that green infrastructure and the benefits. This includes things like bioswales and rain gardens, and intentionally making your stormwater go to an area to a depression where you can filter that in. The plants offer nutrient removal, and then it goes on to your groundwater. So the next slide here. Some examples of nature-based solutions. If you're replacing some of your culverts, if they're undersized and they're flooding, that's an issue for your infrastructure and for aquatic habitat. If you replace that culvert with something that meets Massachusetts stream crossing standards, you have natural substrate on the bottom, you have a bank on each side, which is really going to be improving your water quality because it allows that water to be filtered before it gets into the stream. You have bioswales, like I mentioned. This is in a parking lot at a university in Massachusetts. Planting street trees is a really simple thing for a lot of communities that can reduce urban heat island effect, take out some of that storm water to soak that in and remove those nutrients. Depending on where you put them, you're also reducing impervious surfaces. A wetland restoration project would also count as a nature-based solution, getting those natural features back and those benefits it provides. Permeable pavement is another. This is an example from Devens, Massachusetts, where instead of having a full 20 feet wide of pavement, they had a narrower area of pavement and then permeable pavement that allowed still fire trucks and other emergency equipment to get through, but the water was able to filter through that area. So there are a lot of different nature-based solutions. This is only a small example of them. On our last slide here, overall, what I want to make the point is that nature-based solutions can address your hazards and offer a lot of community benefits. So first, keeping in mind what some of those hazards were, the nutrients, the warmer waters, flashy systems, and drought and water shortages. Thinking about these nature-based solutions that we just discussed, keeping your watershed healthy and your community healthy can really benefit in recreational and tourism benefits, physical and mental health. When we're near, on, or around water, we always are a little bit more relaxed. We also are going to be maintaining our built infrastructure, right? If we're keeping water off of our roadways, reducing that flooding, reducing that freeze thaw. It also is really important for our transportation systems, also emergency transportation, making sure that our roads aren't flooded and people can get where they need to go, and reducing the need for municipal services. So we don't want to have to go save people in a flood. We don't want to have to worry when there's a power outage that we have to get to our most vulnerable citizens that need that energy. So thinking about how we can incorporate these nature-based solutions to get all of these different benefits. And overall, we're going to click once more. We're avoiding costs, and we'll talk about that a little bit later with Mark Voorhees as well. Enhancing our safety, especially for, I mentioned, our most vulnerable citizens or environmental justice and overburdened communities, and overall improving our resilience. So I'm going to hand it over to Danica, and she's going to talk a bit more about how we do this, because if we don't have these prioritized or important in our regulations, we're not going to be able to build them. Thanks, Danica.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danica Belknap. I'm an environmental planner at SRPEDD, which is the Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development District. We are the regional planning agency for Southeastern Massachusetts, and we provide planning assistance and technical services to communities throughout our region, including, among other things, planning for nature-based solutions. So I'm going to focus on some ways that communities can utilize nature-based solutions, particularly through their local land use planning and regulations. So how can communities ensure that nature-based solutions are utilized in local development? In Massachusetts, municipalities do have a reasonable amount of control over how development happens in their communities. And I'll just point out that, as Heidi mentioned earlier, especially for this portion of the presentation, I'm going to be focusing specifically on how things kind of work in Massachusetts, but a lot of the ideas that I talk about are definitely applicable elsewhere throughout the region. And things might be similar in Rhode Island and elsewhere in New England. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so the short story of how local governments control land use is that Local zoning and subdivision rules and regulations are the key to what's going to determine where and how development happens in your community. The long story is that it's a lot more complicated than that. There are a number of different boards and commissions that control different aspects of development in your community. And even between communities, how these different departments manage development can vary as well. So it's pretty complicated, but what we hope to do today through this webinar is to provide you with some tools and resources and general concepts that apply to most communities that you can then adapt to your local community, because you know how your local community works. And even though there's no like one applies all situation or solution, you can use some of these ideas that we're going to talk about today, and you know how they might be able to work within the system of your community. So I'm going to take walk you through a quick example about stormwater. So how does stormwater get regulated within the local community? So there, as I mentioned, all those different boards and commissions will have different roles to play in regulating development and how they might have a say in how stormwater is regulated. So in Massachusetts, our planning boards, they will set the regulations for how subdivisions happen. They can establish design standards for how development happens, including how stormwater is managed, for example, and they will review a number of projects and approve permits that come through for larger scale developments typically. Zoning boards, will have a say in what types of uses are allowed on different properties throughout the town. They also set lot dimensions, sizes, and requirements for how parcels can be developed. Conservation commissions will review projects that may have impacts on wetlands. So not all projects will necessarily get reviewed by conservation commissions, but projects that are on a site that has wetlands or within a certain distance of a wetland typically will be reviewed by a conservation commission. Boards of health typically review and manage water supplies and how wastewater is managed in communities. So they may or may not have a say, depending on your community, on what types of development get approved. Building commissioners will approve all local building permits, so they might get a say in some projects that don't meet some of those other larger scale reviews, so that's something to keep in mind. And then lastly, stormwater committees. Not every community has one. Some communities, typically if you have a bylaw, a stormwater bylaw, or require a stormwater permit, some of those communities will include a stormwater committee that may involve representatives from these different boards in your community. And of course, it's best if you include representatives from each of these boards and committees, from each department in your community. Because what's key to making sure that those nature-based solutions and those resilience goals that you want to see implemented in your community, the key to making that happen is making sure that all of these different departments who have a role to play are on the same page and have the same things in mind. So just as an example, something that comes up a lot in the region is mosquito, the health impacts of mosquito populations and how that relates to stormwater. So a lot of the conventional ways that we handle stormwater in developments involves directing stormwater runoff from a site into these centralized retention ponds. So, and sometimes that type of management can result in standing water that unintentionally may create breeding habitat for mosquitoes. And whereas the Board of Health might have that in mind, a planning board who has the final say in whether that project gets approved may not necessarily be thinking about mosquitoes specifically when they're thinking about stormwater management in a subdivision development. So it's important that you're kind of communicating between departments, and then if the planning board were to consult the Board of Health on projects like that, for example, then they might be able to alert them to that unintentional consequence of some types of stormwater control. And then another thing to note is that if your regulations are outdated, they might not even allow some alternative methods that avoid unintended consequences such as that. So that brings me to my next point of bylaw review or ordinance review. So it's really important to make sure that the resilience goals that you have for your community are reflected in your local regulations, because as we just learned, your local regulations are going to be the final say in what type of development is allowed to happen. So if your local rules and regulations and your bylaws or ordinances are not allowing nature-based solutions, then the developers are not going to be able to implement them. And even where they are allowed, developers still might not utilize them if they're not the easiest permitting option in your community. So if something requires a special permit, for example, that's an extra step that a developer would need to take in order to implement that type of project. So if there's an alternative option that's easier for them to get permitted, then they are maybe more likely to take that path. So you want to make sure that not only are you allowing and encouraging nature-based solutions in your local regulations, but you also want to make sure that that's the path of least resistance for developers to easily adopt. And there are a number of ways that communities might unintentionally be discouraging nature-based solutions locally. So a lot of zoning bylaws require minimum lot sizes in order for a development to happen, and they'll have strict dimensional standards and requirements that a developer must follow, which could result in that sprawling development that Stephanie was talking about earlier, and result in more impervious cover, which would increase those stormwater impacts. It could also discourage developers from taking more innovative and lower impact development approaches, like with cluster developments, for example. Another common thing is minimum width requirements for roads. That again will result in more impervious cover. Requiring curbs along roads is pretty common. A lot of communities will require street trees or some type of vegetated buffer alongside roads. But if and those areas can be utilized to help manage stormwater runoff from the roads and the sidewalk. But if you're requiring curbing along the entire roadway, then there's not going to be a way for the road to access the planted vegetated area. Another example is requiring non-native species. If a plant is not specifically adapted to our climate here in New England, then it might not be as capable of surviving without a little extra help, which requires more energy, more work, and often more watering to keep that plant alive. So that won't necessarily help, especially considering future climate change and how our climate is changing. Lastly, a lot of regulations and bylaws just in general don't mention or specify low impact development or nature-based solutions. So they're not encouraging it, and they're not notifying developers that it's something that's allowed. And neither, they won't always require the preservation of natural features, which kind of goes against what we want to implement with low impact development. So if you want to be sure that your goals for resilience for your community are able to be implemented within your community, then the best way to do that is to kind of do a thorough review of all of your local bylaws or ordinances and make sure that what you want to see happen in development is enabled in your development, and be on the lookout for any potential barriers that might prevent developers from adopting those. And then once you do identify where you want to make changes and amendments to your regulations, there are a number of different ways that those can be implemented in your community. So for general bylaws in Massachusetts, they require a vote at town meeting or by city council. Typically need a simple majority vote to get those types of changes passed. Zoning bylaws are slightly more strict. They require a 2/3 majority vote. In general, there are some exceptions to that, but by town meeting again or city council. Rules and regulations, there are a little more flexibility here because they don't need to go to town meeting necessarily. They can be, amendments can be passed by a simple majority vote of whichever board is overseeing those regulations. So those have a little more flexibility for updates as needed. And because this can be complicated, we just want you to be aware that there are tools out there and resources that can help you to kind of undertake a review of your local bylaws and to help with prioritizing where you can make impactful amendments and where you might be able to get those passed. So now we're going to talk a little specifically about Mass Audubon's Bylaw Review Tool. This tool is an Excel-based tool that you can download on Mass Audubon's website at massaudubon.org/bylaw review. And just a note that we are going to be sharing or you can download the PDF of this presentation now, and it will have links to this website as well as other resources that we're going to talk a little bit about later on. So anyone can download this tool and use it. It's a series of Excel sheets, so the tabs all along the bottom kind of walk you through what the tool is, give you an overview of the goals, how it works, and step-by-step kind of instructions on how to use it. So this page is what the first page or the first tab in the tool looks like. And then I'm going to go through just a couple of the actual analysis tabs quickly so you can all see how it works. So as I mentioned, it has all these tabs, which are different sheets. The first few are kind of overview, instructional, resources, what to look for. And then tabs 5 and 6 are where the analysis happens. So this is what tab 5 looks like. This is specifically focused on a type of development called open space residential design. And some communities have a bylaw that allows this, other communities don't. But if you did want to analyze this specific type of bylaw, then this tab kind of walks you through, and you can see how there on the left-hand side, there's the different kind of regulations that you would be looking for within your bylaw. And then there's 3 columns that have conventional, better, and best practice. And those are kind of, so for each regulation, it kind of outlines what the conventional practice is, what a better way of doing it might be, and then what the recommended best practice is. So the blank column all the way on the right is where you would fill in for each of those rows and each of those regulations. You would look at what your bylaw or ordinance requires and put it in that column. And you can fill that out, and then you can compare yours to what the conventional, better, and best practices are, so that you can kind of see where you align, and this can help you identify where updates are needed. So that's the open space one. This is tab 6, which focuses on zoning, subdivision rules and regulations, site plan review, and if your community has a stormwater or some sort of low impact development bylaw. So again, the same general idea, you would look through each of these bylaws, and the tool focuses on these types of bylaws and regulations because that is where we see the biggest impact and the level of control over stormwater management. Not just stormwater management. Of course, stormwater management is a big focus of low impact development, but this tool is focused on all types of low impact development in general. So preserving natural areas and just in general, having fewer negative consequences on the environment as you develop. So again, for each bylaw has its own column, and you would fill in your regulations, and then you can look at how they compare to the conventional, better, and best practices. And this section of the tool is organized into different goals related to low impact development. So the 5 goals that the tool focuses on is 1, protecting natural resources and open space. 2, promoting efficient compact development patterns and infill. 3 is smart designs that reduce overall imperviousness. 4 is to adopt green infrastructure stormwater management provisions, like low impact development practices. This is probably the largest portion of the tool, and it's most focused on stormwater management. And I'll just note as well that Cape Cod Commission, they'll talk about this a little later on in the presentation, but added some updates to that section that specifically look at stormwater management with regards to MS4, the MS4 permit. So not that it's like a one-for-one direct comparison, but if you are following the best management practices recommended in the tool, then that will likely also to help you conform with, comply with the MS4 permit. So that's something to keep in mind if you are an MS4 community. And then lastly, section 5 is to encourage efficient parking. So once you've kind of gone through and filled in your local regulations, you have this final result where you can compare to the conventional better best and then actually color code each individual cell based on how close you are, which type of practice your local practice is most in line with. And this is the really useful portion of the tool, because then when you're done, you have this like color coded matrix that can really help you to flag where the most impacts are needed. So if you see a lot of yellow, if you like in each column, if you see a lot of orange and yellow, then that's a good hint that maybe that is where you should focus, that particular bylaw or ordinance is where you should be focusing your efforts. The color coding also helps by pointing out if there are inconsistencies between the different bylaws. So one bylaw might encourage low impact development, but if a separate bylaw hasn't been updated as recently, it might still reflect the older, more conventional practices. So that's really important to make sure that not only are you encouraging it in individual bylaws, but that all of your bylaws are in agreement with each other. Once you have this kind of prioritized list of where updates are needed, then this can help you think next about like which changes might be easier to get passed. So for example, administrative changes like we talked about, rules and regulations don't need to pass a vote at town meeting. They can be passed by that board overseeing that regulation. So that might be a good way to prioritize changes that could happen more easily. And then in general, you want to prioritize the issues that are important to your community, especially if it comes down to a town meeting vote. You want to make sure that you have the support of your community in what you're doing. And then just a last tip, you don't have to reinvent the wheel by rewriting an entire bylaw. There are resources out there available to you, in particular the Smart Growth and Smart Energy Toolkit, which is available on the state of Massachusetts website, and we have a link for this at the end of the presentation as well. But they have model bylaws, modules that will walk you through how to identify and what best practices are. So there are a lot of really great resources there available to you. And then lastly, I'm just going to walk through a quick example, a case study in the town of Natick, who undertook bylaw review with assistance from Mass Audubon with a grant from the Metro West Foundation. Natick is a relatively urban town outside of Boston. They are an MS4 regulated community, and they have had several local water body impairments within the town. And they also had minimal controls on stormwater that they wanted to address to help improve local water quality. So they undertook a bylaw review to see where and how their local regulations were contributing to cleaner and safer water bodies so that they can improve water quality in the future, and looked for opportunities to incorporate nature-based solutions into stormwater management that would also be in line with their MS4 permit. So the bylaw review indicated that there were a number of barriers to low impact development in their bylaws. And while the town did have a stormwater bylaw that was passed in 2006, it didn't address a lot of the best practices that were recommended in the tool. And they found that the stormwater bylaw that they did have was only regulating about, or was missing 90% of private properties in Natick. So it was not doing as good a job as they wanted it to regulate stormwater development. So following this review, they received a Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, or MVP, program grant to update their stormwater bylaw, which they did. And then Mass Audubon did another review of the updated bylaw and found significant improvements in the bylaw in promoting low impact development, and it gave them more control over storm water development. So I'm going to quickly show, this is the new updated stormwater bylaw that they implemented. Had a new, previously only parcels that resulted in greater than 4,000 square feet of disturbance were regulated by the old stormwater permit. So the new stormwater permit includes a minor permit and a major permit categories with smaller thresholds so that fewer projects were falling through the cracks. So the minor permit applied to 3,000 up to 20,000 square feet of land disturbance, whereas the major permit, which is more thorough and a little more detailed, applies to properties or projects with over 20,000 square feet of land disturbance. So they were able to have much greater control over stormwater impacts of more developments as a result of this newer bylaw. And it also allowed flexibility for implementing low impact development and nature-based solutions that also help them comply with their MS4 permit. So at this point now, I'm going to pass it over to Mark Voorhees, and he's going to talk a little bit about how implementing some of these nature-based solutions can help avoid the impacts and water quality impacts and associated treatment costs. So take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Danica. Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Voorhees. I'm an environmental engineer at US EPA Region I, which serves the New England region. And I think what I'm going to provide today is some quantification of a lot of what has been discussed so far in terms of the solutions and the impacts. I'm going to provide some quantification to that. And just quickly, I've been involved with water quality restoration, TMDL development, and the last 15 and 20 years or so in the stormwater realm because of the need to address existing stormwater impacts, and directly involved in putting the phosphorus load reduction requirements in the MS4 permit. And in doing so, we have been working on tools and investigations and research to quantify what is the best, most cost-effective way to deal with existing infrastructure. And as we go out and think about that and the challenges involved with trying to fix problems after the fact and restoration, we've learned that it's very challenging, very cost-effective, but doable. But as we start working with communities and realize that a lot of that hard work to restore waters could be undermined or offset or made more complicated as a result of new development activities. So I've shifted focus recently to look at what is the right level of control needed for new development activities to not cause impairments, water quality impairments, or to make sure the water resources are healthy enough recharge, so that the two are working together. The restoration activities are going to make progress, and the new development activities will not cause or further exacerbate problems or create new problems. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just sort of give that background because it feels like there's a very important nexus between new development and dealing with existing water resource challenges from impervious cover. So my focus today is on impervious cover, the conversion of natural lands to impervious cover, looking at those impacts and looking at the management solutions that could minimize those impacts or even offset them completely, at least some of them. And the way we've done this is really developing these tools and looking at things, again, reinforcing the whole concept of nature-based solutions, LID, in trying to mimic nature and trying to mimic the natural process of nature, we need to look at it from a cumulative standpoint, a long-term period. How does it function for all of our climatic conditions, not just from a single design storm? So we've developed these tools to look at this, and we can base it on real climatic data, and we base it on calibrated modeling and calibrated a lot of data, a lot of water quality data, a lot of stormwater performance control measure data to develop tools to help us understand both the impacts and the solutions. Next slide, please. And in doing so, we can then start projecting what are the potential cost impacts if we don't be more proactive and more protective at the time of the development. So here's just a quick summary. And what I'm going to show today is, is really an overview of a lot of detailed information, and really to introduce to you that this information is being developed and it is available in case this is helpful. I think that this reinforces what Stephanie and Danica both highlighted as a lot of the solutions to providing resiliency. So from a hydrologic standpoint, and this is based on a historic rainfall record of looking at hourly rainfall and daily temperature values through modeling, we see that the hydrology is substantially impacted when you take the natural land and convert it to an impervious cover. Runoff volumes, annual runoff volumes increase from 300 to 10,000% over the natural condition. Groundwater is eliminated in impervious cover for the most part, and we're losing on the order of 300 to 500,000 gallons per acre per year for every acre of impervious cover. So major hydrologic impacts just on those two aspects. And then on the nutrient side, which has been mentioned before, is a significant cause of water quality problems, non-supporting swimming, fishing, boating, all those things. That's something that is going to also be further exacerbated with climate change, with warmer temperatures. We are able to quantify and look at the difference between a natural land and impervious cover. And we see that for phosphorus loads, a major cause of nutrient impairment, and especially usually the primary nutrient for freshwaters, is increasing by 300 to 10,000%. And then I'll show you a little more detail. And then for nitrogen, similar magnitude, increasing the load coming from impervious cover by 500% to 13,000% compared to natural conditions. Next, please. And to show you a little more detail on the recharge, this chart is looking at recharge, comparing the natural pre-development conditions to an impervious cover. And what's shown here is these different shades of green. The lighter green is a natural area with highly permeable soils, and moving towards the darker green, which is a lower permeable soil, what we often refer to as a hydrologic soil group D, a very low permeability, often associated with wetlands or dense soils. And on the other end, the high end, the light green, is a sandy soil, and in between there's intermediate permeabilities of soils. So these are taking a wide range of soils and grouping them into these broad groups. But at the very far right of this slide, on the bottom, there's a 0, and it's a little gray block. That's impervious cover recharge, essentially 0. And the arrows and the numbers there are indicating what's lost when you convert these different types of natural lands to impervious cover. These are expressed in inches of depth. So inches of depth. So for example, for the permeable soil, we have 21 inches on average of recharge that occurs per year, which roughly is about 500 to 600,000 gallons per acre per year going into the ground. And then so forth, when you go down to that D soil, that dark green, it's about 25%. So a significant amount of our rainfall, by the way, the rainfall in this case is about 43 inches on this particular record, is becoming recharged. Next slide, please. So I want to just sort of give you that perspective when we look at it more closely. And this is shifting over to looking at a nutrient, phosphorus in this case. We have similar information for nitrogen. And what we're showing here is, again, the groups are based from left to right on the more permeable natural conditions to the less permeable soils. And the green represents the so-called pre-development condition. Looking at, again, based on a long-term cumulative impact or estimates. And then above that is the increase in phosphorus loading resulting from impervious cover. And this is showing you that there's very large increases in nutrient loading that occurs from impervious cover. And it's primarily due to the big increase in runoff and the lack of any kind of attenuation that impervious cover treats. So this is assuming impervious cover that has no treatment, no management to it. Okay, next slide, please. So what we can do with our tools, with the tools that we have and the models that we've developed and calibrated to data, is look at what do we get from different levels of management. So this chart is going to be showing a couple different levels of management compared to pre-development conditions, which is the light green there on the left of each of those groups. And then also in there for reference is this is a recharge, looking at recharge. What will our management solutions do us for achieving the pre-development recharge, because the natural amount of recharge that occurs on an annual basis. So the green is the pre-development, gray is the impervious cover, the 0. And then the 2 bars on the right are the yellow and the blue are 2 different levels of management. And talk about the first one as being the yellow one as being equivalent to applying a Massachusetts existing recharge standards and or meeting a 60% phosphorus reduction as is required in the MS4 permit for post-construction. So what we're seeing here, this is for recharge. For the A soils, the recharge is being met. They meet the pre-development using the MS4, I'll call it the MS4 standard, the yellow. But for the other soils, you can see there's a deficit. There's not as much recharge as is occurring in pre-development. And so there's a bit of a deficit there. So I want to highlight that. But we've developed with our tools, we were able to quantify and estimate what level of control would be needed if we wanted to match our recharge to the pre-development. And that's the blue bar here. So what it's showing here is a level of control that would satisfy pre-development recharge on a cumulative basis. And that translates into a 1-inch retention standard, which a lot of the techniques that Stephanie and Danica were showing you are the methods to best achieve that, and also best achieve that in the lowest impact as possible without having a lot of maintenance burden and things like that. So that I'm going to show you another slide, next one please, to look at the impact on nutrients. So here's looking at phosphorus. Again, the pre-development is green, and that's showing what the natural conditions do for these different soil groupings. And then the impervious cover jacking up the amount of load that comes from impervious cover untreated. And then when we apply these different levels of control, the yellow being the MS4 plus a 6 plus or either the recharge standards and or the 60% phosphorus. In some cases, the recharge standards will far exceed that 60% phosphorus, which is the case for the higher permeable soils here on the left. You can see that there's quite a bit of reduction occurring from compared to the untreated, but still not quite getting to the pre-development conditions. When we apply that 1-inch retention standard that I mentioned in the recharge, we are able to get down to that pre-development, which is very good news. And that's the difference between looking at this in a cumulative way, what happens to the net effect of all rain events that happen, versus just taking a look at a single design storm. So this is good news. So there is a method, and the 1-inch retention standard is in the range of the type of, certainly the technologies are there, and certainly that size is not ridiculously large. Okay, next slide, please. So all of this helps us to kind of start thinking about costs. In this slide, I apologize for having this busy table on the right, and I kind of put it in there thinking it might be just a useful reference to you if this is something that you're interested in. But again, just to reinforce that increasing nutrient loads is a threat. And as waters become more sensitive or more vulnerable to nutrient loading, we are likely to experience a greater nutrient loading if we don't address the nutrients at the time of the development activities. So one of the big things is that it's a lot easier to implement protective controls that will not have this impact, nutrients, and the same goes for recharge at the time of development, then trying to come in after the fact and try and restore through retrofits, through retrofitting or implementing controls to treat existing development. It's a lot more expensive because you're now working in a developed environment that is constrained. You're not going to be able to necessarily put in the size controls that you could have done at the time or integrated the low LID and the nature-based solutions as part of your development once you're dealing with the developed environment. So it's much more expensive, usually about 2 to 3 times per type of control, and it's much more difficult. There's less opportunities. And the retrofits also may require, in certain cases, paying for land or buying land, and it certainly adds to a maintenance burden that a community would have to deal with. So the next slide and my last slide will show you a summary, kind of a summary of these costs that are reflected in this table. And this is just sort of looking at these 3 scenarios that we've talked about: no management, which was the gray bar, impervious cover, untreated, unmanaged, and then the yellow bar being an intermittent, I'm calling it an intermittent management scenario where it's the MS4 post-construction plus existing mass recharge standards. And then the last scenario that actually meets the recharge standards, meets the recharge goals, targets, and also no net increase of nutrients. So starting with the cost, what here is referred to as a cost burden, if you don't do the management and that nutrient load contributes in the future to impairments, to water quality impairments, and out through our permitting mechanisms, which we are required on the Clean Water Act to address, we have to come in and start putting in permitting requirements. Then the cost per acre of not dealing with it at this time, and this is in 2020 dollars, would be about $60,000 to $80,000 an acre for phosphorus. To match, to offset the future increase in load would be about that per acre of IC, impervious cover. And for nitrogen, it's similar magnitude, about 50 to 60,000 per unmanaged acre of impervious cover. So then we can look at moving over towards the intermittent level, and what we see is it reduces that burden, it reduces some of the load, but not all of it, and we still have a pretty substantial cost per acre for phosphorus, about $15,000 to $50,000, and then for nitrogen, $8,000 to $35,000. There's always going to be a range because some controls are really effective, a lot of controls are, a lot of methods are really effective, and it all depends on the type of conditions, the soils, and so forth. And then, but the good news here, the final scenario again is that 1-inch retention standard, which would do a great job with phosphorus and nitrogen, no increase, and therefore a $0 burden. So no burden there. So this is stuff we're working on right now. This is based on an existing climatic pattern. We have done some calculations for future climatic conditions, and we're seeing that this one inch level still looks good, but there's more to be done in that. And that wraps up what I hoping to share with you, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim, who's going to give you a great example of the work they've done on the Cape. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Pasikarnas. I'm a water resources analyst with the Cape Cod Commission. I'm also joined by my colleague, Tara Lewis. And so even though I'm going to do the talking for this segment of the presentation, I want to acknowledge that she did all the actual bylaw reviews and put a ton of careful and detailed work into this project. And so I want her to get due credit for all of that work. So we can jump ahead to the project we did was a regional bylaw review, and it was in the area of Pleasant Bay. And so if we look at the inset map in the upper right, we're talking about kind of the elbow area of Cape Cod. Pleasant Bay is shown, it is the largest coastal embayment on Cape Cod. It is very, it's hydrodynamically complex in terms of the water body itself. It has a very large watershed, almost 12,000 acres. And as you can see, it is, pretty largely most of what can be developed is developed, but it is largely residential and kind of large lot sizes. So it's mostly developed, but also not very densely developed. There are also lots of important resources within that watershed that drains to Pleasant Bay, over 40 freshwater ponds, several tidal rivers. All of the drinking water supplies for the area are located within that watershed as well. And then, you know, as we've sort of broken out here, that watershed is split among 4 different towns. And so when you're talking about trying to manage or, you know, look at how stormwater is managed for Pleasant Bay as a whole, it's a fantastically complex sort of exercise to go through. So next slide, please. So one of the benefits that we had for doing that is the Pleasant Bay Alliance, which is a 4-town intermunicipal organization between the towns of Orleans, Chatham, Brewster, and Harwich, which all share the Pleasant Bay watershed. And it was started in the late 1990s, really centered around this Pleasant Bay Resource Management Plan, which, as you can see, looks at, you know, a whole bunch of different ways that the towns could work together to, you know, protect this really critical resource that they all share. And so the first of these plans was developed in 1998. It's updated every 5 years. And if we can click ahead, so this is all sort of laying kind of a little bit of the background and regulatory context for all of the things that are going on in Pleasant Bay. So Pleasant Bay was studied by the Massachusetts Estuaries Project in 2006. And what this did was it examined the health of the, you know, Pleasant Bay itself, the water quality, and connected the nutrient inputs on land and in the watershed to that water body condition and health. And the MEP report resulted in a TMDL in 2007, which required a certain nitrogen reduction. We can click ahead and see then layered on top of that work, there's also the 2016 Massachusetts Small MS4 permit. All 4 Pleasant Bay Alliance towns are MS4 communities, so they're you know, dealing with all of the MS4 permit requirements on top of the TMDL for Pleasant Bay, and then most recently, the Pleasant Bay Alliance was the recipient of the first watershed permit issued in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We can click ahead just for a look at what the cover of that looks like as well. And really what this amounted to was the 4 towns have now, you know, as part of an enforceable permit, have committed to the nitrogen reductions that were required based on the MEP report and TMDL, and that totals to almost 18,000 kilograms of nitrogen per year that the towns have collectively committed to remove. So it's a really big, complex undertaking that's going to happen over the next 20 to 30 years. But, you know, really there's a lot of study and information in this area, and there's also a huge history of these towns working together, which made it a really good opportunity to explore what regional stormwater management could look like and maybe what some of the obstacles to that might be. So we can move to the next slide. And the bylaw review that we did was part of a larger technical assistance project. And so again, just to provide more context for how this fits into the larger effort, you know, really we wanted to take advantage of a couple of things that I've already mentioned, that there's this long established working relationship between the 4 towns, that we know there are areas of overlap between the watershed permit and the MS4 permit, and knowing that towns are going to be required to do certain things under one permit or the other, identifying if there were any obstacles to them, you know, basically getting credit in both permits for required activities and not having to duplicate effort, you know, expend extra time, costs, etc. And of course, we always want to sort of minimize cost, maximize impact, be as efficient as possible. And very, you know, coastal towns, Pleasant Bay towns especially, finding ways to improve the town's climate resilience is always top of mind. So that's an underlying theme throughout all the work we do. Next slide, please. All right, so hopefully, I shouldn't even have to go through this slide anymore because all the previous presenters did such a good job of it. But, what's the role of bylaw review within sort of this larger effort that we undertook to look at regional stormwater management? And within Pleasant Bay, only about 40% of impervious cover can be directly influenced by the town. So we're talking things like roadways, municipal properties, but the majority of the surfaces that are going to generate runoff and stormwater, the town doesn't have direct control over. So how can the town influence what's happening on those? Hopefully everyone knows it's through the local bylaws and ordinances. And so that's important if we want to click. Obviously, that's important just for management of runoff volumes and water quality, but it's also important from a cost perspective. And Mark went into far more detail about this just before, but really one of the big concepts that we wanted to reinforce is that these future retrofit costs are largely going to be borne by the town and its taxpayers, and those can be avoided through administration of improved local regulations and better stormwater management at the outset of projects. Next slide, please. All right, so how do we actually go about doing this regional bylaw review? We utilized Mass Audubon's Bylaw Review Tool, which was super important, as you'll see, for just being able to do things in a consistent and repeatable manner. And then tracking down and identifying the relevant local bylaws and regulations in each town, and then evaluating each town individually. And then once we'd done that, taking a step back. And it was an interesting process because, what we found is the earlier reviews we did, after having done 4 reviews, you kind of had to take another look at them within, with what you'd learned from doing subsequent reviews, and maybe have a little different perspective. So once we had done all the individual reviews, then we stepped back and said, what can we say about the entire region as far as good examples, opportunities for improvement, etc. Next slide, please. As Danica teased before, because all 4 towns are MS4 communities, we added a separate goal to manage stormwater for MS4 compliance. So there are a couple goals that show up in the spreadsheet. If we click through, you can see that it shows up as an additional goal. It looks the same as the others, but we just wanted to add that so that we could identify where there may be any deficiencies, or just to make sure that if changes or updates to bylaws are being made for other reasons, that they're done, mindful that they also are done in a manner that meets the requirements of the MS4 permit. All right, so we can move on to the next slide and show everyone what it looks like to do a regional bylaw review. And again, you can see that it gets just with the number of specific things that are looked at and the number of different places that these regulations can show up. It can get pretty complicated, and so that's why it's really helpful to have a consistent way to both just work your way through things, and then a consistent way to to evaluate them. And really neat to have this color coding system so that when you zoom out like this, you can really at a glance say, hey, there's a lot of green here, and that's really good. That's indicative of certainly some forward-thinking stormwater management regulations already. But also, the green may go in one column, but not in one row. And so just like Danica talked about, that may show you where, either due to the timing of ordinance adoption or other considerations, where you might have some conflicts, and you can help use this to target how you would iron those out. So next slide, please. So again, local findings, we found that all 4 of the communities already had some good examples within their regulations already. And that's really helpful for, making the case to make these updates, is if there are building blocks to work with that already exist, and so you don't have to create, new concepts whole cloth, that can make adoption an easier sell. We can go to the next slide. But we also found some common areas where there were opportunities for improvement. And again, just the scattering of stormwater regulation throughout different ordinances, different departments, and then the associated responsibility of that means that interdepartmental communication can be really critical. And if that's a problem, either the communication or the staffing, then that may be an opportunity for improvement. Sometimes just, if you think about from the applicant side of things, if the regulations are different, depending on whether you're talking, to zoning versus subdivision versus Board of Health, that can get very confusing. So streamlining or just increasing consistency is better for everyone. And then there were just some kind of very simple changes where preferred design types were not the easiest permitting option, or they weren't preferred, or maybe they weren't even permissible. And so some simple changes might make, even just language changes were available to improve the types of projects that you're likely to get. So we'll move on to the next slide. And then once we had done all of those individual analyses, then we kind of stepped back, took a break, and then said, all right, what does this mean for the entire region, kind of following this pattern again? And so we'll move on to the next slide. And the regional findings, in some ways, they mirrored the local findings a little bit. But one thing that we found was that all of the towns, the concept of having higher standards that apply to critical resource areas already exists. And so you may find this if you have a water protection district or drinking water protection. You may have a district around a surface water body or any of these sorts of critical resource areas. And it might be as simple as just taking the protections applied to those areas and broadening them to a larger area or defining an additional area. All 4 towns that we looked at had open space residential design built into their existing regulations. And that seemed like a common opportunity where, just with some improvements in language or incentives, that we could encourage these low impact designs. And then just again, making sure that consistent review and enforcement, and if you're an MS4 community, making sure that the responsibilities under your stormwater management plan match the responsibilities everywhere else in your regulations will just make operations much smoother and again, minimize confusion. Next slide, please. All right, so here are some challenges that we ran into, and this is a mixture of challenges to actually doing the bylaw review, as well as challenges to taking this bylaw review and turning it into updated local regulations. So as far as doing the bylaw review, the accessibility to the relevant regulations, it kind of varied. Some were available online, some were searchable, some were in eCode 360. These are all things that, just from a mechanics standpoint, can make it easier or harder to do this review. Similarly, language, so different terms used to mean the same thing, stormwater, whether it's 1 word or 2 words, or it's runoff or drainage, and they're all used in the same way, but they can make doing a review a little more cumbersome. So standardized terms can make things easier to go back then and assess how your bylaws are doing later on. And then as far as adoption, so I outlined earlier kind of what the kind of the nutrient environment is within Pleasant Bay. And it's really focused on that watershed permit and the nitrogen reductions. And in Pleasant Bay, stormwater is only responsible for about 10% of that nitrogen load. And the majority of it comes from wastewater disposal via septic systems. And so, you know, knowing what the priorities of your communities are, this may not be an immediate priority to deal with some of these, you know, stormwater management issues because there's such a huge load coming from septic systems. But as those septic systems and wastewater loads are taken care of, this may rise to be a higher priority. So again, it's gonna, you know, the impact of this is gonna vary locally depending on the local conditions and environment. So just be aware of that and think about that if you're considering undertaking one of these reviews. All right, next slide. And again, just some reminders after having gone through a few of these is that the stormwater management isn't always going to be obvious. You know, you're going to have to figure out what the best way to review the bylaws is, and that's going to depend on how accessible they are. And things like word searches and word choices play a much bigger role in that than I think we thought initially. And that also just the language can be very nuanced. So even though word searching can help you navigate through things faster, a lot of the time you just end up having to read it, and there's ultimately no substitute for that. We got one more slide, I think, and then we can take questions. So what we learned from, you know, the individual and the regional look at local bylaws and ordinances, well, certainly having, you know, if you're trying to get multiple towns to work together, established coalitions and relationships are key to doing that. And then really just looking at ways to, you know, minimize the effort required. So look for effective examples that already exist, look for opportunities to just modify language. And if we can utilize a consistent review method for multiple towns within a region, it helps the towns kind of figure out what their neighbors are up to. It can reduce the impression that that making standards higher in your own town may drive development elsewhere because it's harder to develop. That really being consistent just reduces confusion for everyone on, you know, both sides of the permit desk. And with that, I think we're ready for Q&A.
Okay.
So welcome all of the rest of the panelists back up. And
Great. So I have a number of questions here. One of them is pertaining to actually several of them are pertaining to open space requirements. And if you have any suggestions for dense urban communities trying to provide affordable housing along with allowing accessory dwelling units on very small lots. I think this would go towards Stephanie, Danica, Heidi.
Sure, yeah, I can take a first stab at that. So thank you. I think it was Richard who asked that question. So it depends on what your community is amenable to. You mentioned working in really small lots. It's unlikely that you would do an open space residential design on just a single family or a couple of homes, but you might do it on a larger subdivision, for instance, where you're working with a larger land use or a larger parcel of land, and so more opportunity to protect those open space areas. But really, the OSRD comes down to following this really specific 4-step process. And the most important first step there is identifying what the most sensitive environmental features are on the site and protecting those and working away from them. So even if you're working on a one-house lot, for instance, if you're near a wetland or even a storm drain, you want to work away from that and have natural vegetation near it to make sure you're not directing stormwater into it. Sorry, I have a cat that's really trying to say hi here. But hopefully that helps answer your question a little bit. And in terms of what the OSRD Bylaw Review Tool says, I believe it's 60% is a goal, but obviously, what works within your community is better than nothing.
And if Heidi or Danica don't have a follow-up to that, I would like to follow up with these additional questions that are on the same topic of open space. And this question relates in how did you define open space? This meaning, does it allow pervious, permeable pavement and ornate paving, or even paved paths to allow as counting towards percent open space requirements? And I think this came up during your talk, Mark. So I'm not sure if you can answer this, how you defined open space.
Yeah, or I can answer it in relation to the state's model bylaw. So generally, open space would be more areas that are either left natural, or they may be like open grassed areas, like a shared common for a subdivision. There are provisions in the model for up to, I think, 10% of the open space to be used for things like stormwater management, or even wastewater. If there's sometimes, if there's not sewer in the area, might need to do something like a shared septic system, and you could have a leaching field where then that field is also a common sort of park open space on top of it. But not generally things like permeable pathways, except if it was a pathway through an area that was designated as open space, and it was like a trail system, but not so much for things like just sidewalks or that type of thing. And I also just wanted to comment on the accessory dwellings. I think that's really important, and every community should make sure that that you allow accessory dwellings as much as possible. I think that there's more and more of a need for it, with people having extended families, or people getting older wanting to stay in their homes but wanting to have either the additional income or somebody else on the property to help out with the maintenance of the property. And it's a benefit for affordable housing as well. It's a good way to get more housing on the same amount of land.
You don't have to respond, Mark.
I was just going to say that for what the calculations we did, we basically assumed a combination of meadow and forested in natural condition. But we have, and I just want to throw this out there because I think it fits in with a lot of what you've been saying and emphasizing the nature-based solutions. We have quantified the benefits of safely diverting impervious cover runoff to natural areas and what that accomplishes, which is quite a bit. So, and it doesn't, it has to be mindfully done so it's not destroying the natural areas, but those are a lot of LID opportunities there that could be done as long as it's, allowed for. So mention that. Thank you.
Another question from Richard Cania. Do you find permeable pavement to now be more acceptable and to not be so prone to being plugged or breaking down as in the past?
I could take a shot at that. So permeable pavements are really a super opportunity that has sort of been getting some bad press because of the clogging. They do clog, but there is maintenance that can be done on them to keep them working. And even with the maintenance, they tend to be more cost effective than other more structural controls. So there's more to be done on that. But so the good news is that yes, they definitely work, but they do need that maintenance. And that does require special machinery. So unfortunately, that's not quite there, but there's been a recent study. In fact, I'll add it to the chat if I can, or I'll figure out. UNH did, a University of New Hampshire Stormwater Center has done a recent study of restoring permeable pavements, and it's very eye-opening, but it's a huge opportunity, and it's one that I mentioned the resiliency. Permeable pavements have tremendous storage capacity that can deal with very large storms. So in terms of flooding and things like that, they are a very powerful tool. Thanks.
And if I can jump in there, this is Stephanie. One other thing about permeable pavements, why I feel like used to kind of get a bad rap sometimes, is that people didn't understand that maintenance. And so they would continue to salt or sand the permeable pavement, which friendly cat, which would clog it and then require maintenance more often. So when people understand that they shouldn't salt or sand that permeable pavement, they can save that money by not spending it on the salting and sanding, but it does require a change in how you're managing your parking lot or whatever it is, and having the people who are working on it understand that change. So as it's becoming more popular, we're understanding it more, it's functioning better because we're treating it how it's supposed to be treated.
And Stephanie, if I could just add to that, that's a really great point, because the salting is huge, because salt chlorides are becoming such a problem, a huge problem, and also getting in the way of some of the LID techniques because of the groundwater contamination. So the fact that you need so much less salt on permeable pavements could really solve a problem of reducing applications. So besides the cost saving, it also could just avoid like messing up your, the receiving waters too. Thanks.
I have another question here from Mark. That this commenter who, unfortunately, this question, the woman who posed this had to leave, but I think it's a good question anyway. I have some places in country where retention requirement is beyond 1 inch. Are you also suggesting that 1 inch is the sweet spot for achieving what we need to achieve for groundwater recharge and pollution control, and that going beyond 1 inch recharge is not a good use of resources?
So the 1 inch retention standard, I use that word retention intentionally, includes within it, embedded in it, recharge targets to meet calculated average annual recharge amounts, which we use, again, this hourly, these climatic data and hourly precipitation and modeling to come up with those numbers. So the 1 inch retention based on existing climatic data appears to be the sweet spot in terms of nutrient export and the existing recharge. We have done the numbers for a future future estimated precipitation, and that 1 inch still holds, because even though, as Stephanie said, the rainfall patterns are changing, but still, by and large, most of the rainfall is the smaller events, but we are having more intense events that have a lot of impacts. So, but I would not want to say don't go further than that, because the one thing that we have not evaluated is how this affects peak flow control, which is part of the equation that's out there when people are dealing with stormwater and under regulated situations. So I think that these 1 inch retention or a higher value 2 inch retention is going to go a long way to deal with the flooding issues. So I guess I would not say anything bad about it, because I think it's protective. I do just in terms of complete transparency, that is different than what the natural system is seeing, that amount of recharge. Although, I'm going on, but not everything's regulated. So maybe the 2 inches doing it because you're not regulating all the other impervious cover. So on average, it's fine. So sorry, not a very great answer, but I think more to be determined on that in the future.
And if I also could just jump on quickly, thinking about your nature-based solutions, they don't necessarily have to be the only thing you're using, right? So maybe you can use those nature-based solutions to be able to capture your first flush, which is the dirtiest part of your stormwater, right? When it starts raining and running everything off of your impervious cover. So being able to use those to capture that dirtiest first flush is really important. And then from there, being able to capture all the stormwater that you need to, depending on what kind of site you have. Maybe you need to do underground detention or vortex units, et cetera. But nature-based solutions can be pretty important at that first line of defense.
Another question here. Future costs are not typically calculated in local budgets. Could the bylaw analysis include questions on how the town plans to address future costs?
The bylaw tool does include a mention about requiring maintenance and operations within all development plans and permits. It doesn't include a specific calculation of future costs. But certainly, maintenance is something that often gets neglected. And so, more communities are now adopting methods of making sure that developments are following through with their maintenance, or if the town is taking it on under their MS4 permit, they have to take that on as part of their future costs. And maintenance costs for the low impact designs is generally going to be actually less than for your more traditional approaches. It's different, but it could be less.
Heidi, could I mention that for the Taunton watershed, we are working on a project and we are projecting future build out there. We are going to project, make it, it's all above assumptions, but we can estimate potential increases of impervious cover associated with that development and potential costs associated with those different levels of management. And I wonder if that at some point will be helpful for a town to sort of see that, and it's all planning level estimates, but I wonder if that some way would help them to realize again, why not try and avoid, try and do that. We did that for one town, although it will be updated, and it's pretty scary numbers when you start looking at it in terms of taking on a burden. Should EPA, come with a permit and say now you have to reduce that load? So I think more to come on that. But if there's a way that we could streamline that information for you all, for sharing that, so people have at least an idea of what it means for specific locations. That's something that I'd like to look into more. And it's really kind of a GIS analysis at this point, because our tools are pretty well developed to apply that. Thanks.
Has there been progress with aligning the Mass DEP stormwater standards with MS4 requirements?
I think I'm supposed to know the answer to that.
Yeah, DEP is working on that right now. They convened a stormwater advisory committee and they've been working on updates to the handbook and to the wetlands regulations, both for consistency with MS4 and for more climate resilience, updating the precipitation standards. So we've heard that that's going to be coming out for final public review very, very soon.
Hey all, I just wanted to let you know that Margarita Pryor is here and she has asked to chime in on a question. Margarita, you can unmute.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So actually, Mark sort of got at my question, which I did not artfully create, but I was thinking that in many instances, the people that are in charge of making the budget decisions don't want to look like they're raising, people's taxes, raising costs. And so having something in line, and what Mark was describing was the ability to see what those future costs would be in the absence of better management. That's sort of what I was getting at. And if there's a way that your tool could actually talk about that there's some sort of a way of capturing, even, I know in the past, when people were looking for low impact development as part of their local ordinances, just showing the amount of space in the town that was designated for development freaked everyone out. And so it was a big motivator to do things a little bit differently. Unfortunately, it usually led to making larger lot sizes rather than managing the existing inputs better. But if there was a way to sort of standardize at least an initial cost estimate of what happens in the event that your existing build out occurs, this is what you would have to pay for, not just the costs of maintaining the new kind of management that you're thinking of putting in. So that's what I was getting at with my question.
Margaret, I think there's huge opportunity for us to really provide a lot of information now, and over the course of this year, we'll have a lot more. And I think what we need to do is try and think of how we can expand that or simplify it so a town could go through that exercise. So we should talk more about that. Or a town, I know the town's got their hands so full, so that the towns readily have the information to have the number and understand where it came from, so that.
Yeah, that would be great. And I think it gives sort of advocates in the town, the ability to speak knowledgeably about costs too, because they can access the same kind of calculations that presumably that the town managers are using. So I think that would be great help. Thanks.
So I'm going to bring up this presentation again because we do have a few final wrap-up slides.
And we're a few minutes over. So I appreciate everyone who's stuck around for all of this, and the recording will be available, and you'll have the presentation handout. This really is an introductory program here, and Mass Audubon and our partners here and other partners are working on a more detailed curriculum that will actually also include hands-on. We're hoping to do this in person in a couple of locations in the SNP region this summer and fall, where there will be actual working workshops where we not only get presentations, but also have an opportunity to play with the Bylaw Review Tool a bit, and then come back and discuss it and ask questions and explore how really to apply it. So we hope that we're going to answer all these questions for you. This gives you a sense of some of what's going to be in that larger curriculum. And then I think we have a slide with additional resources. Yeah, so this is in the PDF that you have. There's lots of great resources here. In addition to Mass Audubon's LID tool and fact sheets, we have Losing Ground. We have Value of Nature fact sheets based on the ecosystem services literature that's available, the state's Smart Growth Toolkit, which includes model bylaws and presentations and all sorts of other resources. The Metropolitan Area Planning Council has developed a new toolkit that includes a lot of actual examples of, what community has done this or that. And so you can find actual language of communities that have done this. It costs money to do these reviews and to update your bylaws. There are some grants available, including the EEA Planning Assistance Grants and the Municipal Vulnerability Program, Preparedness Program Action Grants. The University of New Hampshire Stormwater Center has tremendous resources available, both technical and more general fact kind of information for sharing. And because the SNP region also covers Rhode Island, I wanted to make sure to include some Rhode Island resources here. So the University of Rhode Island has the Non-Point Education for Municipal Officials program. There's also a Rhode Island Green Infrastructure Coalition, which is a partnership of a bunch of different groups. And then, of course, the SNP network itself. And we also include all of our contact info on the final slide if you have specific questions for any of the speakers. And if you're in the RPA regions of SRPEDD or the Cape Cod Commission, they also provide some planning services to their municipalities. So I want to thank everyone again for attending, thank all of our speakers for all of their hard work and great presentations today, and thank the STEP network and their staff for organizing this and handling all the logistics. I don't know if Tess or Leah or anybody has any final words.
Nothing from me.
All right, great. Well, everyone.
So much.
Yeah, thank you all. Have a great day, and I hope that you found this information helpful. You'll be receiving a survey, and we really appreciate your feedback. And if you're not from a municipality and you get the survey, you're from a larger group, but you're still interested in continuing this work, you can let us know there in the survey too. Thanks.
Thank you.